Hey, welcome back. This is the second video in the Baal Teshuva history video series, and it's also the second video in the broader Jewish history playlist that's available on the YouTube channel. This is the Baal Teshuva spot, and this is only the second video in general, so we'll now talk about this confluence of events that kind of brought about the broader Baal Teshuva movement. And I think it's important that as you enter the Jewish Orthodox community, you understand the history and you understand really what's going on here and what's been going on for the last 55, 60 years. So in the United States, we have the civil rights movement taking place now. This is now the mid 60s, and many Orthodox Jews march with Martin Luther King, and they take part in these demonstrations and these movements. And this plays right into the Orthodox community because now minorities have this pride in them. In the Black community and also in the Orthodox community, people are now proud of their heritage. When before there was prejudice, there was quotas on Jewish employment and Jewish college admissions. And now even the Orthodox Jews have this reason to be proud of their heritage. This kind of backfired on secular and Reform Jews. Reform had always been a way to kind of bridge the gap between modernism and secularism with Judaism. And to be blunt, Reform Jews often did away with Jewish practices and rituals because they wanted to conform to the American society. They wanted to assimilate. And this new civil rights movement, which encouraged ethnic pride, kind of showed Reform Jews and more secular Jews um, that they didn't need to compromise their values and they could be proud of their ethnicity. So around the same time as we have this perfect storm of historical events taking place, the Vietnam War was taking place in the mid 60s and the late 60s, and this spurred the peace movement and a counterculture. We see more drug use. We have rock and roll music really taking off and becoming pretty much ubiquitous in the United States. And this political activism that we talked about where Jews are marching in demonstrations and demanding peace and demanding equal rights. And the Voting Rights Act was passed around this time. So there's these new movements coming about in the United States. There's an emphasis on Eastern religions like Buddhism and Hinduism. And this also led to an increase in interest in Judaism, which was kind of seen as a counterculture of sorts. We have yoga becoming more popular, and vegetarianism, and meditation, which was used to be a key part of Judaism, actually. And there's actually a book written about it called, um, I forget what it's called, but it's by Aryeh Kaplan, who was a leading rabbi at the time. And all these different movements are kind of taking place. And we have what is called the hippie movement, and they were part of this counterculture. They rejected many of mainstream society's pretensions, and they did not see the value in conforming to this new establishment. So in 1967, we have a major historical event that is going to, the consequences of this event are still being felt today, and that is the Six-Day War, which we spoke about in the last video. What's happening? Well, I'll just give you a brief synopsis of what happened in the Six-Day War and what it led to. It was a formative event in Jewish history. Essentially, four Arab armies um, prepared for battle: Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq. And we were outnumbered 10 to 1. The world essentially turned their backs on us, for lack of a better term. Uh, Egypt under Nasser expelled a UN peacekeeping force that was assembled at the Egyptian-Israeli border, and the UN peacekeepers basically just left, exposing Israel to an Egyptian possible attack. So we also have Egypt blockading the Straits of Tiran. The Straits of Tiran is a very narrow passage that is the meeting point of the Gulf of Aqaba between the Sinai Peninsula and the Arabian Peninsula, and it's connected to the Red Sea, which leads out into the Indian Ocean. So this was a major point of contention for Egypt and Israel for years before this, because Israel wanted to retain its rights to travel through the Straits of Tiran. Otherwise, their ships could not leave their ports in the south of Israel, and they could not reach the Indian Ocean. So Egypt blockaded these Straits of Tiran, and this was seen as an act of war by Egypt. So before uh, these Arab armies could attack, Israel made the decision that they would act in their self-defense in their best interest, and they launched a preemptive attack. So just before we go there, I have to say that France, the United Kingdom, and the United States also were part of um, this turning of their backs against Israel. They had made promises that they would defend Israel should the Straits of Tiran be blockaded, and they all reneged on their promise. So this is a common theme in modern history. Uh, the Jewish people are on their own. We're on our own, and we really cannot count on other countries to support us. We need to return to Torah, and that will provide the protection we need, because Hashem has promised that as long as we hearken to His word and as long as we follow Him and pursue Torah, He will protect our borders, and we won't have to worry about relying on other countries. So before Egypt can mount their attack against us, Israel makes this preemptive attack. And the most significant event is the destruction of the Egyptian Air Force. The Israeli planes came through, and the Egyptian planes were completely caught by surprise. Most of them did not even leave the tarmac, and Israel completely wiped out the Egyptian Air Force in basically one day. So Israel at the same time sent brigades into the Sinai Peninsula, and they fought against the Egyptian fortifications there. And Israel took over the entire Sinai Peninsula, and they reached the Suez Canal, a very strategic point in Egypt. Uh, these four countries, the Arab countries, were also backed by Arab countries who were supplying them with material. Um, the the 6 Day War, the lead up to it, was one of very heightened tensions. Everybody knew that Egypt was building up their armed forces. Everybody saw this attack coming, and many Jews feared another Holocaust, actually, which had taken place just 22 years earlier. And Jewish people were digging graves literally to to in preparation for this attack that they saw coming. They dug 20,000 graves in Tel Aviv alone. So the Jews, with this attack against Egypt, kind of built this pride in Jewry around the world. Um, as we were attacking the Sinai Peninsula and destroying the Egyptian Air Force, Israel made overtures to Jordan, and Israel offered Jordanians peace. They said, please don't attack us. You can keep your land, and we don't have to go to war. Uh, the Jordanians completely refused. They basically said the die has been cast, and they decided to go to war with us. So Israel's leaders met about this, and they saw that the Jordanians were going to join Egypt in this conflict, and the Israelis decided that this was an opportune time to take over the Old City and East Jerusalem. So this strategic blunder by the Jordanians cost them East Jerusalem, which included the Old City, It cost them the entire West Bank. And now it also led to this issue where Palestinians, or they weren't called Palestinians back then, they were called Jordanians, but now we have a population of Arab Jordanians living under Israeli rule. And why did this happen? Because the Jordanians refused to accept the peace process, and instead they chose to go to war with Israel. So history does not lie. These are the facts. If Jordanians had accepted the peace proposal, they could have kept the West Bank, they could have kept East Jerusalem, and there would be no Palestinian problem. There would be no Palestinians because the Palestinian movement only began when Israel took over the West Bank, which we in Jewish circles called Shomron and Judea. So you don't have to be ashamed of your history, my Jewish friends and my Jewish brothers and sisters. This so-called occupation was not our fault. We were merely defending ourselves. So at this time, this is all taking place within 6 short days. So after the Israelis start fighting against Jordanians, and there's a move to take over all of East Jerusalem, and there are also battles being waged throughout the West Bank. And around this time, this is like the second or third day of the war, Syria, he gets a false report somehow that Egypt was actually winning the war. So while the Egyptians were being crushed by the Israelis, Syria gets this false report and they start shelling northern Galilee from the Golan Heights. The Golan Heights is to the north of Israel, and it is a heightened, the altitude is higher than the surrounding areas, and this is a key strategic location because whoever holds it can launch these attacks on the lowered surrounding areas. So Israel had this choice to make: do we try to take the Golan Heights? And they agree, yes, it's time, and they launch an attack against Syria by taking the heightened Golan Heights. And it was a very serious conflict that existed there. So this war, um, which is now taking place, really unifies world Jewry, especially American Jewry, and America raises money for Israel. They raised tens of millions of dollars during the precursor to the war and during the war itself. There's demonstrations taking place in Washington and in New York City. There was a rally held in Madison Square Garden, and uh, eventually peace is declared between Egypt and and Israel also signs a peace treaty with the Jordanians, and Syria is forced to stop their military functions. So this strategic blunder by the Arab nations had monumental side effects that they did not see coming. And it should be said that the Arab effort was not to take the land, it was to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. And that meant wiping Israel into the sea. That was their rallying cry, was we're going to destroy Israel and we're going to wipe them all into the sea. So this strategic blunder by the Arabs to wage this war, and especially Jordanians' idea to not accept peace, led to thousands and thousands of Olim, or Israeli immigrants, coming from the United States and Canada and other places. And while this immigration really didn't exist before 1967, now after the war, with this increased sense of Jewish pride, we see thousands of Jewish Olim moving to Israel, making Aliyah, and settling in sometimes these new lands, especially in the West Bank, and this becomes the settlement movement, basically. So this national pride also led to a baby boom in Israel. It lasted about 4 years, and families began having more babies. We gained access to the Kotel in the Old City, the Western Wall, but also to Rachel's tomb in the West Bank, and Joseph's tomb and the Cave of the Patriarchs in Hebron. So now we have these holy sites being returned to Jewish hands, and tourism begins to increase as well, bringing additional revenues to the small state of Israel. It also led to an increased sense of pride in Russian Jews. Russia's Jews were under very bad leadership from the Soviet Union. They were repressed. They really couldn't exhibit their Jewish heritage, and they were pretty much forbidden from practicing Judaism. In the aftermath of the Six-Day War, however, this sense of pride instilled in Russian Jewry kind of gave them the courage to speak out, and they demonstrate and they ask other nations for help. And the plight of the Russian Jews becomes a rallying cry throughout the Jewish world. And even in non-Jewish secular circles, many countries said to the Soviet Union that they have to give the Jews their certain rights, and many Russian Jews demanded exit visas at this time. And over the course of the next 20 years or so, over 150,000 Russian Jews make Aliyah. So, to sum it up in a phrase, this Arab idea to wipe the Jews into the sea completely backfired on them. It made Israel stronger, it made world Jewry stronger, and it unified all of world Jewry around Israel uh, in ways that can only be compared to the Holocaust in terms of this unity that now we have these two kind of twin focuses. We have the Holocaust, which unifies the Jewish people, and we now have the Six-Day War and the reunification of Jerusalem, which unifies the Jewish people. So we talked about this idea, this confluence of forces taking place. All these events are happening around the same time, and it's eventually going to lead to this Baal Teshuva movement, which the seeds of which were planted before the Six-Day War, and we'll discuss some of these events as we progress here. But we have this physical return of Jewry to Israel. We have Olim coming from America and Canada and the UK, and they're ascending to Israel. They're making homes there. They're bringing with them their cultures and Jewish pride. And we have Russian Jews now immigrating to Israel. And this physical return also led to this conquest, really, of historically Jewish lands. We took Shomron and Judea and the Golan Heights, and we took the Sinai Peninsula. We eventually gave it back to the Egyptians with a peace process, but we have this huge increase in lands too. So we have this physical return of Judaism, and we also have the spiritual return, and this is going to make itself known in the Baal Teshuva movement. So we didn't have this institutional framework in place at the time during the late 60s and the early 70s. However, there's this counterculture, this hippie movement, and many of these Jewish hippies take an interest in Judaism. They want to veer away from this rat race, this establishment culture in the United States, especially, and they wanted their own counterculture, so to speak. So around this time, we have the Baal Teshuva movement really taking off. The term Baal Teshuva itself becomes popular during this time, and while previous yeshivot were catering to people of limited background, they called it, or beginners, now we have yeshivot taking off, and their specific niche is called the Baal Teshuvas. So we have Shlomo Carlebach. He is acting as an emissary of Chabad at first in the late 50s and throughout the 60s. He creates his own shul in San Francisco, where this counterculture was already evident, and many of these Jewish hippies visited his shul or took part in the services there. It was called the House of Love and Prayer, but it lacked an institutional framework. So it was not as successful as perhaps it could have been if it had more support. So Yeshiva University was also a key player during this time, as we discussed in the last video. However, they were seen as too mainstream for many of these Jewish hippies who wanted to approach Judaism. Lubavitch at this point was strict in their interpretations, and they were not willing to compromise on Torah values. One of the key elements was this idea that women and men are separated in the Orthodox world, and Lubavitch did not want to compromise that. There was also the issue of touching. Many of the Baal Tshuva wanted to have relationships with women, sometimes casual relationships, and they wanted to hug and kiss, and this was severely frowned upon in Orthodox circles. So many of these Jewish young people did not enter Orthodoxy, and that's reported by Danziger in his work, and most of this information uh, is brought from a book called Returning to Tradition. It's by M. Herbert Danziger, and the link is on my website, esbennett.com. So we have this conflict between Orthodoxy and the Baal Tshuva movement. Are there entry requirements? Do you have to require that new Jews or new Orthodox Jews, I should say, have to do certain things? Do they have to be kosher before they come to our synagogues? Before they enter yeshiva, do they have to be Shomer Shabbos? Can they drive on Shabbos? Can we allow them to pick and choose mitzvot? Are they allowed to just ignore some and follow others that they're more comfortable with? Do we provide these new Orthodox Jews with leniencies that maybe we wouldn't accept upon ourselves? And this conflict persists until this day. And part of this website is I've thought about these issues myself as I kind of envision the website kind of being an outreach website to new Orthodox Jews. So I have to consider these questions as well. And they are playing around in my head right now because this is only the second video. So we won't talk about that right now. So in the old city of Jerusalem, things really start to take off in the Baalei Tshuva movement. Har Zion becomes this old city institution kind of. Har Zion was a yeshiva built specifically for Baalei Tshuva, and the Rosh Yeshiva there accepted these new Orthodox Jews who were very often hippies. He accepted them as they were. He did not pressure them to take on mitzvahs that they did not feel comfortable with, and he takes them in. He teaches them Torah, and his modus operandi is not to overwhelm them, but just to accept them for who they are. So he arranges marriages for them, he finds them employment, he finds them housing, and he really creates this niche community in the old city. And many Jews who are visiting the Western Wall as a tourist find their way into this institution, this Har Zion. Excuse me. Other yeshivot did not take this approach. Chappelle's is also located in Jerusalem, and they use a more traditional approach. They cater to what they call beginners rather than Baalei Tshuva, and the Rosh Yeshiva there makes a conscious effort to not publicize his yeshiva and to not advertise. He wants to cater to beginners who have already made the decision to learn Torah. So his niche is not really the Baalei Tshuva hippies, but more people who were serious about Torah and who had taken on some of the commandments already. So the hippies brought their culture into the Har Zion, for example, and to other places in the Baalei Tshuva movement, these Baalei Tshuva yeshivot. The hippies put tofu in their children. They set Jewish prayers to rock music. And actually, there was a popular hippie band that used to put Jewish prayers to rock music, and they would play every Motzei Shabbos right after Shabbos ended. They ate whole wheat challah, and they still dressed like hippies, except they wore talis. So they brought their culture into the Jewish fold. So this is all taking place in the late 60s, early 70s. Carl Bach establishes his House of Love and Prayer in San Francisco, and we have this conflict between Orthodoxy and this Baal Teshuva movement. And many in the Orthodox community frowned upon this movement. They felt that these Orthodox leaders who were reaching out to Baal Teshuva were compromising Orthodox values. And there was rumors that drug use was popular in some of these Baal Teshuva yeshivot, and that was a major problem in the Orthodox community. So some of these movements were looked upon with suspicion. However, around this time, and it still says today, Danziger reports that 85% of new Orthodox Jews still found their way to Orthodoxy through a synagogue as opposed to the Baalei Tshuva yeshivot. So at this time, aside from Karlbach Shul, there were really no synagogues catering specifically to Baalei Tshuvas. So what we're going to talk about in the next video, as we see this confluence of forces coming together and all these events taking place at the same time, is the Chabad House. And in the next video, that's the plan. We're going to talk about how this idea came to be and how it spread first throughout the United States and Israel, and then eventually into other countries. And now Chabad houses are all over the place. So we'll talk about that in the next video. Thank you for watching. I hope this is entertaining or at least informative. And please visit the website for more information. I try to post all the sources I get these videos from. And we'll see you next time. Thank you.